My name is Sarah Whitmore, and the day we buried our son should have been the day my husband and I held each other tighter than ever before. Instead, it was the day he chose to walk away from me. Not weeks later. Not after the guests had gone home.
Not in private.
He did it at our son's funeral. And what makes this even harder to say out loud is that he had no idea what I had already done days before that moment. Something that would change his life forever. Before I tell you what happened, I want to ask you something.
If the person you married chose the most painful day of your life, the day you buried your child, to abandon you,
what would you do? Would you beg? Would you scream? Or would you stay silent, knowing the truth would eventually speak for you? Tell me in the comments.
I read every one.
And if you're new here, welcome. This channel tells real, emotional stories about love, betrayal, loss, and the quiet strength people find when they are pushed beyond their breaking point. If stories like this resonate with you, make sure to like the video and subscribe. These stories are not easy to tell, but they deserve to be heard.
Now let me take you back to the beginning.
Our son Ethan was 16 years old. He was gentle, thoughtful, the kind of boy who still hugged his mother in public without shame. He loved photography, late-night talks, and making people laugh when they least expected it. He died suddenly. One moment he was here. The next, he was gone. The doctors used words like accident and unavoidable, but none of those words mattered. Nothing prepares you for the moment you are handed a folded hoodie that still smells like your child and told there is nothing more they can do. From the moment Ethan died, something shifted inside my husband Mark. At first, I thought it was grief. We grieved differently. I cried.
I barely slept.
I replayed every memory, every conversation, wondering what I had missed. Mark became distant. Quiet. Sharp around the edges. He stopped coming home early. Stopped answering questions. Stopped touching me. At night, I would lie awake next to him, listening to his breathing, feeling like I was sleeping beside a stranger who wore my husband's face. I told myself we were just hurting. That people say terrible things when they're broken. That marriage means surviving the worst moments together. I wanted to believe that. But grief has a way of revealing what was already there. 3 days after Ethan's death, while our house was still full of flowers, sympathy cards, and unfinished casseroles, I overheard a phone call Mark thought I couldn't hear. He was in the garage. His voice was low. Controlled. "I can't do this anymore," he said. "It's not my fault.
She is falling apart."
I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart pounding so loudly I was afraid he would hear it. "She blames me," he continued.
"I want to live like this."
That was the moment I realized something terrifying. Mark was not grieving our son. He was protecting himself. That night, while he slept, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at Ethan's school backpack resting against the wall. I thought about the last argument Mark and Ethan had. About the pressure.
The expectations.
The way Ethan had looked at me afterward, quiet, exhausted, defeated. And something inside me began to connect dots I had been too afraid to look at before. The next morning, while Mark was out running errands, I made a decision. I did not cry. I did not confront him. I picked up my phone. And I started making calls. Calls Mark never knew about. Calls that would change everything. By the time the funeral arrived, I had already done what I needed to do. Mark stood beside me in his black suit, dry-eyed, impatient, shaking hands with people who told him how sorry they were. I barely heard their words. My mind was elsewhere. Because I knew something Mark didn't. And when he leaned toward me, his voice cold and quiet, and said the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "This is over.
I can't be married to you anymore."
I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't stop him. I just looked at him. And waited. After Ethan died, the house filled with noise, but inside me there was only silence. Friends came and went. People cried, hugged me, told me how strong I was. They said all the right things, the things people say when they do not know what else to say. But every night, when the door closed and the lights went out, I sat alone in the dark and listened to my thoughts. And that was when I realized something that terrified me more than the grief itself. Ethan had not been okay for a long time. I replayed memories I had buried because they were inconvenient, uncomfortable, painful. His sudden mood changes. The way he flinched when his father raised his voice. The nights he stayed up late, staring at his laptop, pretending to do homework. The time he asked me, quietly, if it was normal to feel like you were never good enough, no matter how hard you tried. I remembered how Mark had brushed it off. He's dramatic. He needs discipline. Stop babying him. And then there was the last argument. It happened 2 weeks before Ethan died. Mark had lost his temper over something small.
A missed deadline.
A grade that was not perfect. I had heard shouting from the living room. Then silence. When I went to check on Ethan, he was sitting on his bed, staring at the floor, his hands shaking slightly. He hates me, Ethan whispered. I told him that wasn't true. I told him his father was just stressed. I told him everything would be okay. I told him lies. That guilt sat heavy in my chest now. 3 days after Ethan's death, while Mark was busy answering condolences and avoiding me, I went into Ethan's room alone. The door still creaked the same way it always had. His posters were still on the wall. His camera sat on the desk, exactly where he left it. I sat on his bed and let myself cry for the first time without holding back. That was when I noticed his notebook. It was tucked under the mattress, hidden the way teenagers hide things they are afraid to share. My hands trembled as I opened it, already knowing that once I started reading, there would be no going back. The first pages were normal. School notes.
Random thoughts.
Song lyrics. Then the tone changed.
I can do anything right.
Dad says I'm weak.
No matter what I do, it's never enough.
My breathing became shallow. Several pages later, my heart stopped completely. I wish Mom knew how bad it really is. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming.
I read every page.
Slowly. Carefully. And with each sentence, a truth I had avoided began to take shape. Ethan had been drowning, and the person pushing his head under the water was the man I had married. That was the moment I knew. This was not just grief. This was accountability. That afternoon, I picked up my phone and made the first call. A lawyer. I told her everything. About Ethan. About Mark. About the emotional pressure, the verbal abuse, the patterns that now seemed so obvious. She listened quietly, then asked me a question that changed everything. Did your son ever tell anyone else? I didn't know. But I was about to find out. The next call was to Ethan's school counselor. She went silent when I mentioned his name. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. He asked me not to tell you, she said softly. But he told me he was scared of disappointing his father. By the end of that call, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I spent the next 2 days collecting everything. Messages. Emails. School reports. Notes. Witness statements. I did not confront Mark. I did not let on that I knew anything. I watched him carefully. The way he talked about Ethan as if he were an inconvenience even in death. The way he complained about the funeral arrangements. The way he avoided any conversation that required responsibility. And slowly, painfully, I understood something I never wanted to accept. Mark was not just incapable of supporting me through grief. He was afraid of what would happen if the truth came out.
The night before the funeral, I finalized everything.
Documents signed. Calls returned. Evidence submitted. I sat alone in the living room, surrounded by photos of my son, and whispered an apology into the empty air. I should have protected you sooner. When I went to bed that night, Mark slept soundly beside me. He had no idea that by morning, his life was already unraveling. Because while he believed I was broken, helpless, and dependent, I was preparing for the moment when he would finally show the world who he really was. And I knew he would. People like Mark always do. The morning of the funeral arrived with a silence that felt unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath.
I woke up before dawn and lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to Mark breathe beside me.
He slept deeply, peacefully, as if nothing in his life had changed. As if our son was not gone forever. I watched him for a long moment, memorizing the face of the man I once loved, knowing it would be the last time I ever saw him the same way. When we arrived at the cemetery, everything looked exactly the way it should for a day like that. Gray skies, damp grass, rows of quiet chairs, white flowers arranged carefully around a small casket that felt impossibly wrong for a 16-year-old boy. Ethan's friends stood together in silence, their faces pale and stunned. His teachers were there. His classmates. People who had seen him every day and never imagined this would be how they said goodbye. I stood near the casket, my hands folded tightly in front of me, feeling as if my body was moving on autopilot. People hugged me, whispered condolences, told me they were so sorry. I thanked them politely, even when I could barely hear my own voice. Inside, I felt hollow. Like my heart had already been buried with my son. Mark stood a few steps away from me, arms crossed, jaw tight, scanning the crowd as if he were late for an appointment. He did not cry. He did not touch me. When people approached him, he nodded stiffly and said, "Thank you for coming," as if he were hosting a business event instead of mourning his child. During the service, Ethan's best friend spoke. His voice cracked as he talked about late-night conversations, inside jokes, dreams of traveling together after graduation. I felt my knees weaken and had to grip the side of the chair to stay upright. When it was over, when the casket was lowered into the ground, something inside me finally gave way. The sound that escaped my throat was raw and broken, the sound of a mother realizing there is no coming back from this kind of loss. That was when Mark leaned toward me. People were still standing nearby. Ethan's grandparents were only a few feet away. The priest was still speaking quietly to the family. And yet Mark chose that moment. His voice was low, controlled, and utterly detached. "This is over," he said.
I can't do this anymore.
At first, I didn't understand what he meant. I thought grief had scrambled my hearing. "What?" I whispered. "I'm done," he said, eyes fixed on the ground.
I can be married to you. You falling apart, and I want live like this.
I stared at him, stunned. My son's coffin was still open. The earth had not even settled. And my husband was leaving me.
Not because of time.
Not because of healing. But because my pain inconvenienced him. People around us began to notice.
I saw faces turn. Whispers start.
Someone gently touched my arm, asking if I was okay. Mark straightened his jacket and stepped back as if distancing himself from something embarrassing. "I'll be in touch," he added coldly. "We'll sort things out later." Then he walked away.
Just like that.
I stood there, frozen, as my marriage ended beside my son's grave. I felt eyes on me, pity and shock mixing in the air. Someone asked if I needed to sit down. Someone else offered water. I nodded numbly, barely aware of who was speaking. Inside, something shifted. I did not cry. I did not chase him. I did not beg. Because in that moment, I understood something with terrifying clarity. Mark had just shown everyone exactly who he was. And I had already done what needed to be done. Later that afternoon, as the last guests began to leave, two unfamiliar people approached me. A man and a woman, both dressed professionally, their expressions calm but serious. "Mrs. Whitmore?" the woman asked gently. "Yes," I replied.
Detective Harris. This is Detective Moore.
"We're very sorry for your loss."
Mark was nowhere in sight.
"We need to speak with you," she continued. "About your son." My heart began to race, but I nodded. We stepped aside, away from the remaining guests. Detective Harris lowered her voice. "You contacted us earlier this week." "Yes," I said quietly. "We reviewed the information you provided," she said. "The journal. The counselor's statements. The messages." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "And we have some serious concerns." I swallowed hard. "About Mark," she said. At that moment, I saw him across the cemetery parking lot, talking animatedly on his phone, completely unaware of what was unfolding behind him. Completely unaware that the control he believed he had was already slipping away. Detective Harris followed my gaze. "He doesn't know yet, does he?" she asked. "No," I replied. "He doesn't." She nodded slowly. He will. As the detectives walked away, I stood alone once more, staring at the fresh earth where my son lay. I knelt down, pressed my hand gently against the soil, and whispered words I had been holding inside for days. "I'm so sorry it took me this long," I said softly. "But I promise you, I won't let him erase you." The wind stirred the leaves above me, and for the first time since Ethan died, I felt something other than grief. I felt resolve.
Mark found out the truth 3 days after the funeral.
Not from me.
Not from a dramatic confrontation.
And not in a way he could control. He was at work when the call came. That much I learned later, through lawyers and second-hand whispers. 2 detectives arrived at his office and asked him to step outside. His co-workers watched as his confident posture faltered, confusion flickering across his face. He assumed it was about paperwork. Formalities. Loose ends. He was wrong. By the time he came home that evening, his certainty was gone. I was sitting at the kitchen table when he walked in, the same place where I had made those phone calls days earlier, the same place where I had finally chosen my son over my fear. He stopped when he saw me, his expression shifting from annoyance to unease. "What did you do?" he asked. That was the first time he looked at me since the funeral. I folded my hands calmly. I told the truth. His jaw tightened. "About what?" "About Ethan," I said quietly. "About what he was living with. About what you did." He laughed sharply, a defensive sound.
"This is insane.
You're trying to blame me because you can't handle losing him." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I slid Ethan's notebook across the table. His face drained of color as he opened it. I watched him read the words our son had written in the dark, alone, afraid. Watched his hands begin to shake. Watched the mask crack. "You had no right," he whispered. "I had every right," I replied. "I'm his mother." Mark stood abruptly, pacing the room. "This doesn't prove anything. Teenagers exaggerate. You know that." "The counselor didn't think so," I said. "Neither did the detectives." He froze. "What detectives?" I met his eyes for the first time. "The ones you spoke to today." Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. "You went to the police," he said slowly. "Yes." "You're trying to destroy me," he snapped. I shook my head. "No. I'm making sure Ethan isn't erased." That was the moment Mark finally understood. This was no longer about grief. This was about accountability. Over the following weeks, everything unraveled. Child Protective Services reviewed old reports that had never been connected before. Teachers came forward. Emails surfaced. Patterns emerged that could no longer be ignored. While no legal system could give my son back, it could acknowledge the harm done to him. Mark lost more than his marriage. He lost his reputation. His job. The version of himself he had built so carefully. Friends stopped calling. Family distanced themselves. People began to ask questions he had no answers for. And me? I mourned. I mourned my son. I mourned the man I thought I married. I mourned the years I spent excusing behavior I should have confronted sooner. But I did not regret what I did. One afternoon, months later, I visited Ethan's grave alone. The grass had grown in. The earth no longer looked raw. I sat beside it and spoke out loud, even though no one was there to hear me. "I didn't save you," I said softly. "But I will tell your story." The wind moved gently through the trees, and for the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt honest. Mark and I never reconciled. There was nothing left to save. He tried once to reach out, to frame himself as misunderstood, as a victim of circumstance. I did not respond. Some conversations no longer deserve answers. Healing did not come all at once.
It came slowly, in quiet moments. In learning how to breathe again.
In allowing myself to feel joy without guilt. In understanding that loving someone does not mean protecting them from the consequences of their actions. And this is what I want you to take from my story. Grief does not make you weak. Silence does not mean surrender. And sometimes, The bravest thing a person can do is tell the truth no matter who it implicates. If you are listening to this and you have ever been made to feel small for your pain, or blamed for someone else's cruelty, know this: your voice matters. Even when it shakes. Even when it comes too late to change the past. And to my son, wherever he is now, I hope he knows this. I finally chose him.